Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming. So I'm going to ask questions for a little while, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So please think about what questions you'd like to ask. I've decided that I have far too much hair on my head and far too little on my chin to be sitting in this august group, but here I am. So before I get started asking questions, I'm going to turn it to Binya first, just to talk about his book a little bit, and then we're going to turn to Erik just to raise some points that he'd like to raise before we start my questions. So over to you, without further ado.
Thanks very much. So the Economist Hour is the history of a revolution in policymaking that got underway in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, where economists became increasingly influential in government, and particularly in advocating for the government to step back from active management of the economy and to place a much greater reliance on markets. That process really gets underway through the 1970s and continues over the next 4 decades. The bulk of the book is a history of the rise of economists. It's the story of the way in which economists became more influential. And it begins, just to sort of set the stage for you, with the story of a young man working in the bowels of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the 1950s, an economist who's basically employed as a human calculator and who doesn't think that there's a future for an economist at the Fed. He goes home and tells his wife one night that he needs to find a job in another line of work because economists don't run the Fed, economists aren't in charge of anything at the Fed, they don't really have a role or a future there. That economist's name was Paul Volcker, and by the end of the 1970s he's running the Federal Reserve, and today the Fed is America's largest employer of credentialed economists. So that arc from obscurity to dominance is really the story that I'm telling in my book. It has been important in many ways. It has reshaped policy in the United States, in some respects for the better. Economists have introduced important innovations in the way that we consider and make policy. Cost-benefit analysis is an excellent example of an area in which economists have introduced a real discipline to decision-making, a careful consideration of the costs and benefits of government policies, regulations, that has really allowed us as a society to make better choices. But on the whole, I think that the Economist's Hour has been detrimental in important respects. Economists argued for a turn toward markets on the grounds that it would increase economic growth, which in the 70s had become a big concern, that it would lift all boats, that society would benefit broadly, and even that it would strengthen democracy. It's a treat for me to be here at the University of Chicago because many of the central characters in my book worked here, including Milton Friedman, who argued that democracy would be strengthened by a reliance on markets because we wouldn't need so often to get together and figure out what to do. A lot of decisions would be made through the market, and we could reserve the hard choices that couldn't be made through the market for the democratic process. So in all of these respects, there was an argument made quite explicitly that this would be better for society. And I think it hasn't been. I think that economic growth has slowed with each succeeding decade. Inequality has greatly increased. And our democracy, frankly, is being strained by that inequality because we, the people, have less and less in common. And that makes it harder for us to make collective decisions. So the story of how the economists exercise that influence and the consequences of that influence, I think we'll have a chance to talk about as the evening goes on, but that in broad outline is the book.
Imagine a world in which there's no future for economists.
Some of my students have done that already.
So Erik, go ahead.
I've also been told that Binyamin and I look alike, just to keep track at home. I'm the one to the left of Bethany, just to make sure that you can. So the book itself is, as Binyamin pointed out, about 90% history. And it's meticulously researched, and it is wonderful in that dimension. There's 10% of the book where the thesis that Binyamin puts forth is that the rise of economists, particularly pro-market economists, causally affected low growth today and higher inequality today. And I think that part of the book, and hopefully we could talk about as we go through, is less meticulously researched and more, conjecture on his part. And to the extent that there is some sorts of evidence, there's usually a lot of correlations, where we kind of nudges us towards causation. So I'm hoping tonight, I have three things on my mind as I read the book. Again, putting aside the history, which was fantastic, fantastic. The three things I had on my mind are, what is the evidence causally of economists increasing inequality and causing low growth from their pro-market approaches? And there's going to be some narratives in the book that I think are going to be at odds with conventional wisdom of economists. Some are going to be selected in ways that might be in favor of some of Binyamin's arguments, with other ones being omitted that might be against the argument. And some are, I think, spot on, and we should have these are nuanced issues that we should be having some discussions on. Along the way, as I read the book, I was also thinking about, the selection and the stories that were told. And, the book is called The Economist Hour, but there is lots of economists out there. And there were many influential economists during the same time period that had a tremendous effect on public policy, that were promoting active roles for governments during this time period. And three things come to my mind. There's the expansion of the minimum wage over the last half century. Economists were instrumental in both their research and their advocacy for these policies that I think had, positive effects on lots of people. We debate about whether it's a good policy or not, but there's no doubt about it that economists had some influence in that domain. Right here at the University of Chicago, my colleague Jim Heckman might be the most preeminent social scientist of the last half century, or arguably, if I had a Mount Rushmore, he'd be up there. And his research on early childhood education was instrumental in the expansion of Head Start and other programs that I think have lifted the boats for lots of individuals around the world. And our colleague at Booth, some of you have taken his class, Dick Thaler, in his work melding behavioral economics with economics and influencing that on the policy domain, and nudging people, particularly at the low end of the income distribution, into saving programs through some government initiation. Again, had big potential welfare implications. So when we're thinking about the Economist Hour, is this a book of the representative Economist Hour, or a selected set of some Economist Hour? And that's something that was on the back of my mind as I went around. And related with that is another corollary in my mind where I think there was some omission, in the sense that there are some policy debates where there is near consensus among economists, or lots of consensus. There's near consensus hardly on anything, but lots of consensus, such as in response to climate change, with things like a carbon tax to help mitigate effects on the environment. And yet we've had no influence in that domain. And so we're out there where there's a lot of knowledge among the economists, which hasn't merely broken through to the policy domain. Which brings me to the last point I want us to keep in the back of our mind tonight, is what is the interaction between the economists and the political system? And so at some point in the book, and I think it's true, that the economists come out, they go up on Mount High and they preach their gospel, and the politicians in the world hears that gospel and implements policy. And I think sometimes in the book, that's exactly what happens. But then there are other times when the policymakers want to implement some policies, and they grab an economist, and that economist might have an extreme view, and use that economist as justification for their policy. And so how do we think about this interwoven, relationship between economists and policy? Again, when I come back to it, and we think maybe later on tonight we could talk about things like climate change. For whatever reason, we're not getting any policy traction, and I think part of the reason is the politicians just might not want it at this time.
So we'll come back to that issue of climate change, but let's start with this issue, the economists, which economists? You write at the beginning of the book that you think it is possible to think of economists, particularly in the US in the second half of the 20th century, as a homogenous community. So talk about how you got there to that decision.
So I think the questions that these are the right issues to talk about. These are important issues, and they do require some nuance. it is undoubtedly the case that any discipline that includes both Karl Marx and Milton Friedman is not going to be defined ideologically. Economists are incredibly diverse, there's no doubt about that. But what I think is important is that particularly in the closing decades of the 20th century, American economists on both the left side and the right side of the political aisle came to agree about a number of very important issues on which they were very influential as a consequence. And actually, I think minimum wage is a really important example of that, because what happens in 1987, the New York Times editorial board wrote a piece calling for the abolition of the minimum wage on the grounds that we, my predecessors, not me, had spoken with all the economists, and they all agreed that the minimum wage was a bad idea. That was pretty close to an absolute consensus at the time. A survey of economists in the late 70s found that more than 90% of them agreed that the minimum wage was a bad idea. And what happens is that in the early 1990s, economists begin to do actual empirical work on the minimum wage, and they find, much to their surprise, that the theoretical models are wrong, or at least don't fully describe the nuances of the effects of the minimum wage, and you get a revolution among economists and then among policymakers, and we're still, it takes a long time for that to work through, but we're now finally seeing the minimum wage start to rise at the state level at the very least. So the timing of some of these developments, like if you want to draw a hard line in the sand, it's true that some of this change starts happening before 2008, and that's a good example of a change that began earlier. But it does follow this general model where there's a period of time where sort of a free market theoretical view of the way that wages should work in the abstract, that companies have a certain amount of money, and if you make them give more of it to some workers, they're going to have fewer workers. Really takes hold and is adopted by policymakers on the grounds that economists basically agree about that. And you've got people like liberal economists like Paul Samuelson and conservative economists like Milton Friedman both arguing that the minimum wage is a bad idea. Policymakers understandably looked around and said, hey, if everyone thinks it's a bad idea, maybe it is. And for a long time, the minimum wage is kept at a low level by virtue of that scholarly consensus. So I think that that's an example of an issue where there is a sufficient consensus, and there are others as well. That should not take away from the fact that on any of these issues, there were economists outside the consensus, there were heterodox economists using different approaches, economists who simply reached different conclusions, but it was sufficiently the case that the group of economists whom policymakers consulted, called to testify, brought into the White House when they were elected, agreed on these issues, that I think we really can speak of a degree of homogeneity during this period.
So are you sold on homogeneity if minimum wage is no longer the example that disproves it?
No, I mean, there's lots of other things going on at the same time. Let me kind of invert it one way and kind of go with another example where I think it's kind of the flip side of this court. So, there's a large amount of the book devoted to Art Laffer. And so for those who are unfamiliar, Art Laffer was an assistant professor at Chicago in the early 1970s, then kind of left for the private sector, and then went to the public, or had some influence in the public sector afterwards. And so Laffer got famous, and you might have heard this, anybody who kind of even reads the popular press, like in any dimension, the words the Laffer curve is kind of tossed around as part of the vernacular that not only economists, but readers of economics will hear from time to time. And that kind of curve is kind of the relationship between tax rates and tax revenues. And so in your mind, you could think about when you tax somebody zero, you're not going to get any tax revenue. And when you tax somebody 100%, you're not going to get any tax revenue because nobody's going to work. And then there's some kind of hump-shaped relationship in between. And because there's a hump-shaped relationship, there's some tax rates where tax revenues might be the highest. And so Laffer would go around and say that maybe if we cut taxes, tax revenues will go up and taxes will pay for themselves. And so that was a position, both at the time and today, that is way far away from what I would consider to be the mainstream of economic thought. Some of that is an evolution, but I will go back and say even at the time that was an outlier. And so today, the University of Chicago runs a survey of economists, about 50 economists. A question a month comes to us. There's 50 economists of all types, liberal, conservative, microeconomists, macroeconomists, short, tall. I mean, every dimension will be asked. And so one was asked recently, because Art Laffer is still in the news. This was about 2017, about the Trump tax cuts, asking us, the economists, if the Trump tax cuts were implemented, would tax revenues go up, in the foreseeable future? And so then the economists have a choice to strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or uncertain. For this question, 100% of economists disagreed. 90% of them strongly disagreed. And you know how hard it is for 100 economists to agree on anything in this kind of thing. And it's just on the outside of the mainstream thinking that tax cuts are going to lead to tax revenues. Now, politicians still talk about that. Now, at the time this was implemented, even Binyamin points out, the liberal side of economists at the time, people like Paul Samuelson, would mockingly, give a lecture called, Why We're All Laughing at Laffer. And he simultaneously says, well, Milton Friedman really didn't believe tax cuts would generate higher tax revenue. He might have been for them anyways because he wanted a smaller government. But yet the policymakers at the time wanted the extreme, this view that you could sell to the populace that tax cuts could actually raise tax revenues. But yet it wasn't a mainstream economic view. And again, in my mind, I again harken back to kind of climate science, when I think there's some settled wisdom among the scientists, but then every once in a while I click on CNN and there's two people debating each other, making it seem like it is an issue. And I think economics has some of that, and some of the narratives that are in the book, I think we're more in that camp than, preaching from Mount High, converting as one voice from the economists.
So is the Laffer case, as Erik raised in the introduction, is it possible that policymakers latched on to extreme economic thinking in order to justify what they wanted to do already, rather than economists somehow forcing that change from their own thinking?
So I think that it is clearly the case that the rise of supply-side economics is not an example of an issue on which you have an absolute consensus among economists and policymakers.
Yeah, that's different than tax rates raising tax revenues, yes.
Right. So what is the case, though? I think the story is a little bit more complicated. The originator of these ideas is actually not Laffer, but another Chicago professor named Robert Mundell, who argued that a combination of supply-side tax cuts and strict monetary policy was the correct prescription for what was called stagflation, the combination of high unemployment and high inflation in the 1970s. He was a very respected economist. He later won the Nobel Prize. And he made this argument, and it was considered a bizarre argument at the time, for sure, but it did command a certain academic constituency, and it began to make waves in Washington, where policymakers were looking for solutions, in particular for a drought of investment, of business investment. They were specifically concerned about the evidence that business creation was flagging, investment in capital equipment was flagging. They were looking for something to do about that. And Mundell's ideas, popularized by Laffer, seemed to fit the bill. And I think in general, when you're thinking about a model of change and when economists exercise influence, the contrast with climate change is actually really helpful, because I think what you see is that when there is a crisis, a specific question, a failure of public policy, that is the hour in which policymakers start looking around for alternatives. And if there are available alternatives that are compelling, they may seize upon those and adopt those as policy. And I think the difference with climate change is that we have not, perhaps we should have, but we have not reached a point where our political leaders have felt a sense of crisis sufficient for them to begin considering serious changes in policy. So what happens with supply-side economics is that it's adopted on a bipartisan basis in the 1970s as a solution to catalyzing business investment. It's then embraced in broader form, essentially as a political program by Jack Kemp and subsequently by Ronald Reagan, who makes it sort of the keynote of his 1981 tax cuts. And that at that point, there are still a lot of credible economists who are advocating for it. People like Marty Feldstein are backing supply-side tax cuts. Alan Greenspan also goes out there and testifies on behalf of the Reagan tax cuts. And so you've got very prominent conservative economists lending their voices to that program and arguing for it as a serious economic response
to the problems of the day.
Yeah.
Even 2 decades later, when the Bush administration does the second big round of tax cuts, you still get 250 PhD economists, most of them tenured professors at major institutions, signing a letter saying, we know it didn't work in 1981, that's because it wasn't sufficiently focused on businesses, we're going to do it again and we're going to get it right this time.
So, but there's a distinction between supply-side economics and cutting taxes and raising revenues, which is kind of what a lot of the book goes for when we start talking about the fiscal side. So supply-side economics, for anybody, is when the government policy affects the production side of our economy. Now, it tends to get lumped in a very political sense, that if we cut taxes and then stimulate business investment or us to work harder. But supply-side policies also include public education, where we educate our workforce and they become more productive tomorrow. And I think most economists believe that there is a supply response for many government policies, right and left. Where I think the debate is today is how big are those elasticities, and as more data is coming in, we're getting refining on whether those elasticities are big or whether those elasticities are small. But that again is a very different thing, even though at the time, about whether tax cuts are actually going to raise tax revenue, which then leaves us in debt is kind of one of the narratives that you kind of put into the book. I think that even at the time was an extreme view among the supply-siders who thought that you could still get an increase in output, but that increase in output would never compensate for the loss in tax revenue from the lower tax rate.
The specific proposition that tax cuts would fully pay for themselves, which was always overstated because it had to do also with lowering interest rates and also, but that specific proposition, I think, was never broadly held.
Yeah.
But it is the case that people like Marty Feldstein and Alan Greenspan were not just endorsing cutting taxes, they were endorsing the specific idea that lower tax rates would induce business investment.
Yes.
And that was part of the prescription. Now,
I think it's
just to
still
finish
true
my
that
answer,
people think that.
that there's an effect, right?
There's an effect. Now, how
Absolutely.
big that effect is, that's
It's
the
fairly
question.
controversial, but there's no doubt that we are now at the point where supply-side economics has essentially become something, borrowed from economics and moved almost entirely
to
into
the
the political
political.
domain. And I do not at all think
Yeah.
that, the Trump administration's tax cuts reflected a program, that academic economists would endorse or structure in
Yeah,
that way.
or even in the truism that I think you and I are supply-siders in the sense that we probably are big fans of public investment in things like research and development and human capital, which are all, in the literal sense,
There
a
is a
supply side.
of the economy.
Exactly,
No one should
exactly,
doubt that.
exactly.
know.
So that's why I said it's
Can
been
we back up-
co-opted in a political sense now.
Can we back up a little bit back to the influence that Keynes had and why that went wrong? Because there's a question I had as I read your book that certainly this market-based view wasn't monolithic, at least for years. It was far more Keynesian. And then something went wrong and the policies didn't work. Why is that? Was that situational in your view? Or was it a failure to implement policy? Or was it a mistake in the policy?
So I'd say, this is a very broad strokes history, but, what you get when the Great Depression happens in the United States doesn't know how large the American economy is. Congress literally hires an economist to figure that out for the first time, a guy named Simon Kuznets, and he comes up with GDP. He basically reports back and says, the economy used to be this large and now it's quite a bit smaller. And that's the first time that anyone has done that. And once you know how large the economy is, you can begin to think about managing it in the same way that, the first time we got pictures of the planet Earth, we started thinking differently about the environment and managing the environment. So you have your hands around it, and Keynes is one of the first guys who starts, sort of prescribing on that basis a specific set of policy responses for managing economic conditions. In general, what I'd say about economics during the 20th century is that macroeconomic theory runs way ahead of the data. The data takes time to be developed and accumulated and analyzed, and in the meantime, economists are offering very bold stroke prescriptions for what should be done about the economy. So Kuznets, who has a couple years of data, starts pronouncing about the long-term relationship between growth and inequality, and writes a theory that people keep talking about for a long time about the way that inequality plays out in advanced societies. He didn't know. He didn't have the data. It took a long time for us to get the data, and it turned out he was completely wrong. But, for a long time, everybody talked about Kuznets' theory of inequality. And so, in general, you get that phenomenon in a number of spaces where, the early sort of theoretical premises about how the economy worked proved to be insufficiently nuanced or insufficiently, grounded in data. And over time, I think economics has really been able to improve and refine its understanding on that basis. The specific failure of Keynesianism, though, turns out to be political. Part of what they argued was basically that you could manage macroeconomic conditions by, when you needed to juice the economy, you would cut taxes and increase spending. When you needed to slow things down, you would do the opposite. And in the early 1960s, they are enormously successful in juicing the economy. And by the late 1960s, inflation is rising. And Johnson's economic advisors literally walk into the Oval Office and say, hey, boss, it's time to raise taxes. And he looks at them like they're crazy, because that particular approach to managing economic conditions is not politically viable. And the result is the stagflation of the 1970s. So I think Keynesianism, runs into a political.
There's oil price shocks, and there's a whole bunch of other things. There's a whole bunch of other things that were causing inflation at that time.
So would you argue that it's not as simple as a political failure?
I think so, because I think I'm kind of a Keynesian, but yet I still believe that the advances, so just to set the stage for those who haven't read the book, because we've jumped in a little bit, there's a movement, what comes after as Keynesianism fails, monetarism and monetary policy becomes a more active role in the management of the economy. And I think that was going on at the same time. And I think the science and the data at this time were actually kind of working together. And so the theories come along. Listen, when you have a big supply shock, prices start rising. If you start feeding that supply shock with tax cuts, so it's a negative supply shock, prices rise and quantities fall. So we're having a recession and inflation going up. That's the stagflation. And so the policy response might be, let's get rid of the recession by stimulating demand. And you could stimulate the demand by increasing government spending or cutting taxes or reducing interest rates by increasing the money supply. But what that does is feed the inflation. And so one of the, again, this is probably, I would say, among the economists I talked to, and there's not many parts of the book, but this part of the book is probably the least grounded in economics of the other part, which is the nuanced discussion that the inflation starts changing expectations. Once you started increasing the money supply yesterday to get us out of a recession, we start expecting inflation tomorrow. It gets built into inflation expectations, and that process continues. So now we're stuck when Volcker comes into power at the head of the Fed, and we're stuck with these really high inflation rates. He makes a choice, and science said we should have, and empirically it ended up being what happened, that you could break the inflation cycle by resetting expectations. And the only way you could do that is by restricting the money supply, which lowers demand and created a recession. So the Fed, on purpose, created a recession in 1982 to break the inflationary pressures. And that wasn't, some of Friedman. That was also, Nobel Prize winning work from Bob Lucas and talking about the role of expectations and the way you would have to reset expectations. And from that event, inflation from the modern developed world has now been eradicated from the fact that we learned from the theories of the 70s. We ran it in practice. Maybe we got lucky, but it broke the inflation at that time, reset expectations, and now we're in a world with low inflation going forward. And so, again, I want Binyamin to come back in a second, but because the next part of the book is the Fed cares only about inflation and stopped caring about workers at that time. And that's something I want to push back on, but maybe you should tell your side before I push back.
But no, I think, so far, I basically agree. I mean, I think that is the narrative.
That was good. That was my PhD was good. At some point, I was worried about it. So Luigi might have revoked it on the spot.
There's a couple wrinkles that I don't know how far we want to
Let's stay away from the total wormholes.
It can still be revoked to later tonight.
Paul Volcker, for example, thought very little of Bob Lucas's work. Told me that he didn't agree at all with Lucas, and so I think to attribute Lucas's influence, I think is wrong. But these are footnotes. I think that part of the narrative is fine.
One of the big questions in the book that you are getting at, though, is what caused the situation we're in today, right? And I think the headline of your piece, your New York Times op-ed, was "Blame Economists for the Mess We're In." And I think you'd argue that there's a strong causation between economic theory and income inequality. And so I want you to start by offering your theory on that, and then we'll come back to Erik to no doubt disagree.
So I want to begin by saying that something journalists often say, but it happens to be true, which is that we don't write the headlines. So
I actually, that does happen to be true, because that's happened to me too.
So, I think we can stay with monetary policy to make this point because it's actually a really interesting example. Yeah. It's an example of where the revolution goes too far. So bringing inflation under control was necessary and desirable, and it happened. But what you get as time goes on is that economists begin to argue that the only thing a central bank needs to do is to keep inflation under control, and indeed that getting inflation lower and lower is better and better. So Alan Greenspan, who succeeds Paul Volcker, literally goes before Congress in the mid-1990s and testifies that 2% inflation is good, but 1% inflation is better, and 0% inflation is even better than that. And at the next meeting of the FOMC, one of his colleagues asks him, what is your evidence for that proposition? And Greenspan literally responds, I don't have any evidence, but I expect that someday we'll be able to prove this. Well, that's a hell of a thing to tell Congress if you don't have any evidence for it. And the effect was that Alan Greenspan was engaged in a relentless war on inflation without any evidence that it was good for the economy. And the way he conducted that war was by maintaining unemployment at a higher than necessary level. The Romers have calculated, for example, that the average unemployment rate during this period was a full percentage point higher than it needed to be. And that's millions of Americans who didn't have jobs. And as the Princeton economist Alan Blinder has observed, there's no greater driver of inequality than unemployment. So that's just a very clear example for me of an area in which this revolution goes too far. And the specific actions of economists are a contributor to economic inequality.
Could I respond?
Yes.
Okay. So there's so much wrong in it, and so.
Did I get anything right?
No. So the trade-off we make. So the question about what is the right inflation rate, about 1%, 2%, 3%. Is something that I still believe there is a debate about, and I think central bankers now are in the ranges of 2 to 4%, and I don't know why that's not 1.5 to 3.5% or so. But we've run experiments, not us particular, but other countries have, where the inflation rates are 10, 12, 15, 19, 20, 1,000%, and we see that there are negative things that come with those. So we know low and particularly stable inflation tends to be better than variable, which is often associated with high inflation. But the idea that the Fed is making permanent trade-offs on the unemployment rate is just not what the Fed is supposed to be doing. So in your mind, again, I see Philip out there, David, some of my students floating around, talking about different types of unemployment. And so the Fed is charged, and this is the only real tool it has, as kind of moving cyclical unemployment. This is a kind of fancy word you get. When the economy is below its potential level, some workers are sitting idle. By moving the economy back to its potential level, those workers could go back to work. Okay. There's lots of other types of unemployment that occurs outside of recessionary periods. And I want to get back to this. We're hardly ever in a recessionary period anymore. But those other types of unemployment, something like structural unemployment. This is a lot of where my work is. The Times has covered it. You might know about it. The different types of unemployment where things like automation or China comes along and puts workers out of work, and they no longer have the skills to fill the jobs in the labor market which they're in today. The Fed has no control over that type of unemployment. That is a painful unemployment. This is the type of unemployment I study. This is the type of things I try to help to mitigate through some of my work. But the Fed has no control over that whatsoever. And I think the greatest advance, one of the greatest advance in economics over the last 40 years or so, is the ability for central bankers, not just in the US, but around the world, to better manage the economy such that we don't get recessions that much anymore. So people, again, I was born in '71, so I don't remember all of this going on, but recessions were very frequent in the early part of the 20th century through up till about 1980 or so. There's this period economists with our, desire for hyperbole referred to as the Great Moderation after the Volcker recession, where business cycles, recessions have become rare in the United States. Okay, they don't not exist. We had a big one in 2007. But that recession was much smaller than the same type of shock that occurred in 1929. So my finance colleagues, like Luigi, say the banking shock that hit the economy in 2007, 2008 was massive on the scale of the Great Depression. But we had an order of magnitude less effect. Why? Because the science of monetary policy has enabled us to mitigate the effect of that on workers, on the unemployed. Unemployment was lower than where it was because of the science of monetary policy. And so that part of the narrative, there's other parts I want to get to. At some point, we got to get to the good stuff that I like. But that kind of that narrative is just not. And so the eradication, not the eradication. Again, I'm using hyperbole. The mitigation of business cycles, because of active intervention from the Fed, where even though they're trying to keep unemployment low, or inflation low, is simultaneously keeping unemployment low, is a major advance, again, in the developed world during this time period.
But it strikes me that you're giving economists credit for fixing something that Binyamin might argue economists helped cause. In other words, the 2008 financial crisis. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Okay, we could get to the 2008 is kind of at the same point, and we could then talk a little bit about, the banking sector and deregulation of the financial sector, and that's the good part of the book. I want to come back to deregulation. But here's the key thing: the hand that the Fed was dealt at this point was, given the hand they were dealt, they mitigated the effect of that than they would before. The Fed doesn't deregulate.
First off, the Fed was the central actor in deregulation, and we can talk about that. But
I actually would agree with that.
Yeah, but two other points about this. The first is that the Fed took the view that maintaining low inflation conduced to financial stability. Part of what Bernanke described as the Great Moderation was that effect, and so they misunderstood the value of what they were doing, and that also contributed to the crisis. And the other point that I'd make is that part of this worldview was that if you just focused on low inflation, the other thing you didn't need to do and shouldn't do was fiscal policy, and that just doing a good job of monetary policy, that was the macroeconomic lever that government should be pulling. And so this other opportunity.
But what period are you talking about? Like 90?
What?
2000, we used tax rebates to stimulate the economy. 2008, we used tax rebates.
In 2008, you get a temporary stimulus, and then you get the president standing up before the nation to announce that America is a household and it can't afford to borrow anymore.
But there was stimulus that was going on during that period, in a Keynesian sense, in a way that theory would say. Now, we might have argued we should have gone further, and then Paul Krugman has made that argument that maybe we should have gone further. But the answer is we did do some fiscal policy at this time.
Fiscal policy stuff. The question is whether it was constrained relative to what it would have been, but we can move on.
We have to open it up to the audience for questions in a little bit, which should be great fun. But let's get to an area of the book on which you might agree, which is just to end things on a happy note, which is the role that economists have played in suppressing competition in our current existence of too big to fail, in whatever context that is.
Yeah, so I think one of the clearest examples of the ways in which economists have influenced economic policy making is in the realm of regulation, and specifically in antitrust, where an older and broader set of ideas about what the government should be doing to preserve competition in the marketplace was replaced by a very narrow standard that was designed here at the University of Chicago, and basically said, if prices are going up, there's a problem. If prices are not going up, corporations can do what they want. I'm simplifying, but this consumer welfare standard came to be the standard by which antitrust was enforced in this country, and it had the effect of permitting corporations to consolidate, permitting corporations to collude with each other, permitting corporations to engage in behavior that had previously been regarded as anti-competitive, but because it could no longer be shown that it would increase consumer prices, was no longer prohibited. And this narrow conception, which economists articulated, taught to lawyers, taught to judges, essentially directly. There was literally a guy named Henry Manny who convinced corporations to fund a program where he re-educated the federal judiciary by taking them to Miami for a couple of weeks, wining them and dining them, and having famous economists come lecture them on how they should rule in cases involving economic issues. So that by the end of the 1980s, fully half of the federal judiciary has been through this re-education program. It's really a remarkable example of the way that economists, rewrote the federal approach to regulation.
So, there's again about 3 chapters in the book. My favorite 3 chapters were on this part of the thing. Now, maybe it's also farther than my area of expertise, but in terms of I agree, let me start with the beginning part. So there was a huge movement of deregulation that occurred in the 70s. And again, that was coming through a lot of the economists, and then on the backside through the legal sector. And the reason deregulation was taking place was there were some firms that had some market power that were not, in some sense, serving the consumer base. There was only, regulations where this firm could only correspond in this area, this firm could correspond in that area, and they wouldn't be able to compete with each other. So part of the reason of deregulation was to promote competition. Now, what has happened is one of the effects of that is that now we've gotten lots of big firms as we've gone through. And I think this is kind of the ending part, how this might be affecting growth today, is now there's these big firms out there, and when you're that big, maybe you're enacting anti-competitive forces. And I would have to say, this is an active area of research among lots of economists right now. I believe Luigi is someone who also thinks on that types of issues, about, have we gotten to the point where now firm size is an anti-competitive factor? And then the next thing is the right policy prescription to that. But the question I want to think with that is, on net, we started with a situation with very little competition. We did policies that promoted competition at the gains of lots of consumers. Now I could fly a lot cheaper than I did before. So a lot. I should have mentioned this for those who didn't read the book. Great discussion of airline deregulation in the book, and where you get this outcome where consumers can now fly at fractions of the cost into more and more places than they did, in the early 1970s. And I think this is where Binyamin might, kind of want to say, well, maybe we went too far in some of that. And my answer to that would be, maybe we went too far in that. And that's kind of an area where we're actively doing research now about whether their firms are getting too big and they're suppressing competitive forces.
Or maybe some of the issues are industry specific, right? Depending on issues within that particular industry. But on that note, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. I'm sure there are a million out there. Or we can keep going if there are not.
I have
Silence.
some.
There's one back there.
Hi. I'm an Elizabeth Warren supporter and followed the New York Times editorial board endorsement process pretty closely. And I was very disappointed to hear you say that Pete Buttigieg was, quote, on the front lines of corporate price fixing, because that's something his employer said he didn't do. It's something the company that fixed prices said he didn't do. And so I'm curious, some of this goes back to our conversations about revisionist history, but if some, scrub on the New York Times Metro desk or new hire on the New York Times Metro desk wrote an article that they made up, or they made up key facts in the article, would it be fair for me to say that Binyamin Appelbaum is engaged in fake news and on the front lines of corporate fabulism, or is that a stretch?
I think this one's for you.
Yeah, I think what I was interested in is, I think it's really interesting. I think we're not going to take too many questions about other things tonight. This is a conversation about the book. But briefly, the question refers to an interview that the New York Times editorial board conducted with Pete Buttigieg. One of the things I find fascinating about his background is that he has really spent his post-college years on kind of a tour of the front lines of neoliberalism. He worked for a consulting firm that was busy, cutting jobs and raising prices for a healthcare firm. He went and worked for a Canadian company that was involved in fixing the price of bread, and he worked as a consultant on grocery pricing there. He went to Afghanistan and was both a consultant and a soldier. And so I think it's really interesting to ask him to reflect on those experiences. Nobody's accusing Pete Buttigieg of having personally fixed the price of bread. The premise of the question is that he was there and he worked as a consultant there, and I think that's what I'd say about that. We have questions about the book?
Yep.
Right there. We've got microphones over here, guys.
Yep. There's one there too. Or you can just stand up and yell, but.
First of all, I really enjoyed the book. And my favorite anecdote is when you mentioned that John Maynard Keynes didn't trust the market but did very well as an investor. And Milton Friedman loved the market and was a terrible investor. Anyway,
It's perfect.
my question is, because I sort of came to political consciousness during the so-called Reagan Revolution, and his whole story was, big government needs to be cut, and taxes need to be cut, regulations need to be cut, and it was a very simple idea that proved appealing to a lot of people. And I think your book, I'm oversimplifying like crazy, but in a way your book is a post-mortem on that idea. And what comes next? I mean, what's the, because I do think, as has been said up here, in a way, your book might have been better titled The Free Market Economists Hour. What now? I mean, are we you skewer economists pretty thoroughly and pretty adeptly in your book. Are we done with economists? What is the next thing, and how do we make it politically saleable? I'm thinking in particular of the recent election in Britain, where, okay, neoliberalism may have run its course, but people don't seem to be coming up with a politically saleable alternative and a name for it and a set of ideas that makes it sing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
a couple of quick points about that. The first is that I think the reason this book is not called The Free Market Economists Hour is because I think it was absolutely crucial to the success of these ideas that they were embraced more broadly. And what you saw is liberal presidents and liberal economists agreeing with some of these basic ideas and carrying them into force. The British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli had a famous line where he said, that essentially Tories conservatives in Britain were the most effective implementers of liberal policies. I think the opposite has played out in recent decades. In many cases, it's been liberals who've been the most effective implementers of conservative policies, not just in the United States, but under Mitterrand in France, under Tony Blair in Britain, where it has been the case that it is the fact that liberal parties have embraced these prescriptions that has made them bipartisan and permanent parts of our economic policy. So how do we move forward? I think we're already in a period of ferment, frankly. I think the last decade, since the economic crisis, has been like the 30s and the 70s, a period in which economists are reconsidering some of their assumptions, reopening debates that had been closed, considering new approaches. We've heard a couple references to the type of work that's going on, and I think much of it's very exciting and promising. I don't know what emerges from this, and I think there's good reason to be afraid that people will get angry enough about the failures of technocracy that they'll lose faith in the ability of smart people to make good choices, as it were. And frankly, the current administration reflects that. The current president has less regard for economists than any of his modern predecessors, has largely set aside these types of approaches to decision making. His constituents, his supporters seem to like that. And I think there's a real question about the ability of economists and of other technocrats to reclaim public trust. I think it's an urgent issue.
For those who haven't read the book, Binya writes a pretty stark line, which is that the Economist Hour did not survive the Great Recession. And Eric, would you agree with that before we turn it back to the crowd?
That was shocking to me because I'm still doing work, and I think
You're still employed.
and I'm thinking that I'm saying this in a sense. I believe I am part of an Economist Hour, that the economists still do have a role to play in very different forms. Let me just give an example. I'm currently working on issues of gentrification. Okay, so that's kind of stuff I'm dabbling in right now. It's a big issue in many urban centers, affordable housing. And so, and I am immensely interested in the well-being at the bottom part of the distribution throughout most of my work. Yet when I start looking at potential solutions to gentrification, things that I am against are going to be things government intervention like rent control, because I think that is observably bad for people at the low end of the distribution in these urban centers. And I am in favor of restricting land supplies, or if you will, deregulating the housing in these urban areas. And so I really think that I am trying to do work that is trying to help a certain part of the distribution. I think I am part of the Economist Hour now, but yet I'm in policy space that wasn't too different than some of the policies that were going on in the 70s by limiting certain types of government intervention, like rent control, and promoting land supply, free building going on. So I'm struck whether I'm part of the Economist Hour or did I miss it? I keep saying, my daughter keeps saying, "Okay, boomer," and I'm like 48, and so I'm wondering, if there was a time that I would, but I still think I'm fighting the good fight, and I think economists have a role to do so. So, am I part of an Economist Hour? Where am I?
I mean, I think the Economist Hour is over in a very particular sense, which is that this period of consensus and of relative reliance on economists ended. And it is now a lot harder for economists to make their case about some of these issues. And the consensus, I think, has considerably fragmented. So what we're seeing is, after a long period in which rent control was essentially anathema in most American cities, a real revival of interest in it, despite a continuing consensus among most economists that it's a very bad idea. And so, there are other trade policies, a wonderful example of an area in which sort of the verities and norms of economics during this period, are being questioned. And we're seeing a willingness to pursue new kinds of policy that simply wouldn't have been plausible even a decade.
But do you think if the climate, like you said earlier, if climate changed in a sufficient way that got the attention of the public or policymakers, would the economists then have a role? This intersection of politics and environment.
I think you're pleading, Eric. Could we have a role?
I apologize.
I think economists absolutely still have a role. I think economists bring a lot of value, and the key is to take what they do well and use it.
Let's turn it back to the crowd, but I think there's a good argument for diversity of views now instead of one monolithic view, right? But there's a question over there.
Yes, thanks. A question about economics and social sciences.
We'll go there next.
It seems like a lot of, if you see a social scientist on TV or probably reading, it's almost inevitably an economist, almost never a sociologist or another type. Do you have any, did your research take you into sort of like how economics has sort of crowded out the other social sciences and public debate?
Can we also repeat the question, because we're being live streamed now, so if anybody doesn't have a microphone, you will not be picked up. So let's just repeat the broad 1 second.
The question was about the way that economics has crowded out other social sciences disciplines. I mean, it's clearly true, right? I mean, there's only one kind of social scientist that has its own office at the White House, and it's economists. Every federal agency has its own economists. An antitrust trial is a competition between two groups of economists. Like, in many spaces, the dominance of economists is a very real phenomenon. And it has come at the expense of other disciplines in many areas. So I think descriptively that's undoubtedly true. It's not the focus of my work, but it's clearly the case.
There was a question back there that I'd missed. Go ahead.
Hopefully this just turned on, did it?
Yes.
I want to step back a step or two to the end of your discussion. We're talking about the anti-competitive nature and the increasing anti-competitive nature of our economy and tie that into the internet. I'm just curious how you see the government, the body politic, and corporations adapting to create anti-competitive policy and antitrust policy in a world of Google, Amazon, et cetera, kind of taking over as monopolies. And do you see a lot of change coming in policy in the near future? And I know I'm asking you to predict, and that's very hard, but.
So I'll start at just a broad sense. Again, this is an area of work where we are thinking in real time about the real effects of such things. So on the one hand, the places like the Googles and the Apples and such, some argue are promoting innovation because there's a whole bunch of small businesses out there that are innovating, hoping to get bought by one of them, okay? And then once they get bought, that innovation will be in Google and Apple and such. And it's still the case that lots of innovations, I'll even go further, most innovations that are having big effects, both in the US and around the world, are originating in US companies. So there is this belief that there's still lots of innovation going out there. At the same time, there is evidence such as markups are going up in some of these companies. So what is a markup? It's going to be the price over marginal costs. And so, why is that happening at the same time? And is it because they have a little bit more power? And so I think this is going on in real time. So it's hard for me to predict. it is something that I agree is worth studying further.
Would you argue that where we are with Google and Facebook, you can trace a direct line from this idea that consumer price was everything?
I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, so part of what is new and challenging about these tech companies is, they're offering their services for free to consumers, and so the traditional antitrust model doesn't cleanly apply to their operations. And the question is, are there other respects in which we ought to regard their operations as anti-competitive? I think it's a fascinating area. I think, you did a good job of sort of describing the outlines of that question. I don't know. I think it's something that I think a lot about, but don't have a strong feeling.
You mentioned the Microsoft trial in the book. Where does that fit in?
Well, Microsoft, so that's kind of a different case. That's a much more classic example of a company asserting market power. Microsoft is engaged in what's called tying, which means conditioning the sale of one product on another product, using its market power in one space to build market share in another space. This is something that used to be regarded as presumptively anti-competitive. The law simply said if you got caught doing it, they could make you stop. And over time, the courts have basically changed the way that they approach these types of issues, moving from a rule that says this is anti-competitive to a case-by-case consideration where you basically need to demonstrate anti-competitive effects. It makes it much harder for the government to prevent these kinds of corporate conduct. The Microsoft case was part of that process. It was the instance in which the government decided that tying wasn't always bad. And so it happened to be a tech company, but it wasn't really it wasn't the case that it sort of raised these new issues about a different business model.
But it's the last big antitrust case that the government brought, right?
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. There was another question all the way in the back there.
Thank you very much. My question is kind of twofold. So first part is to Professor Hurst. Are there occasions that you believe that economists kind of jump to conclusions too fast without having strong enough evidence? And I would like you to touch on maybe a few examples if you believe that's the case. And then Binyamin, my question would be like, if you don't have strong enough evidence and you need to make a decision, how do you go about it? Isn't it like the best option to hear the best economists that study a certain topic and go and follow their advice, or are there other options that you consider most advisable?
So the answer is yes. So the question is, do economists overstep the bounds all the time? Yes. So does every person I've ever known in any discipline.
Not journalists, not ever.
Oh my God, you're killing me right here. and so, and part of it, and so in a historical arc, I view economics like in any other science, in the sense that knowledge has been growing over time. And as more data has been coming along, and Binyamin pointed us out early on, we had a lot of theory without a lot of data. As we're getting a lot more data, things are becoming, easier for us to test. And so at some points in time, people do overstate their bound. And I'll go even further. The people who often have a lot of influence in any profession sometimes are the ones who speak, evangelically about things. And economists are no different than anybody else in that dimension. And so lots of economists, say things like, on the one hand, but on the other. And that makes it harder to have as much policy influence because there's a lot of gray in the background. And so sometimes the policy influence comes from people who kind of pound their fist and believe evangelically. And so I agree, yes, that is the case, but I think data is disciplining more of us. That still doesn't mean that some people who have outsized influence tend to be the farthest from the frontier of the profession.
I had an economist tell me the other day that he was recently told, he works at a think tank in Washington, he was recently told by his boss that he wasn't testifying before Congress often enough, and he said he felt this tremendous pressure because when a committee would call to ask his opinion about an issue, he'd give a fairly nuanced answer and they'd hang up on him. And so the incentive for him is basically to give a less nuanced answer so that he can go testify before Congress, which is his job. So I think there's tremendous pressure on economists, particularly the ones who are trying to be policy relevant, to reach clear conclusions even when that's difficult. With regard to your question, yeah, listen, policy needs to be made. And one thing that I would distinguish between is
even in cases in which I think the wrong choice was made, it's not necessarily the case that I think anyone did anything wrong. It can be the case that people operating at the frontiers of knowledge needed to make a choice. They made it. In retrospect, we can see that there was an error and we can learn from it, but it doesn't in any way diminish the fact that they had to make a choice at that time. You got to work with the best information you have, and sometimes you got to guess, and sometimes you're working with really imperfect information, and you do what you can.
Could I just ask, do you find the tools of economics useful for policymakers, despite the fact that any one economist might go too far?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and cost-benefit analysis is a great example of an area in which the tools of economics have disciplined the way that policymakers approach these questions by forcing them to sort of make explicit the trade-offs, to consider the costs and benefits in balance against each other. And so even where economists are offering competing perspectives on what those costs and benefits are or on how to value them exactly, it's still the case that the framework itself has real value.
And do you think that potentially, go back to some of the questions we had earlier, is why the economists get a little bit more in the offices relative to the other social sciences, because of the framework we built?
Absolutely, and because also there's an illusion, that's not always good though. Sometimes it becomes a crutch, right? So you reach for the guy who's offering you the cleanest system. So one of the stories I tell in the book, Stephen Breyer, a Supreme Court justice, in the early 1980s, he gave a speech about why he had come to embrace the Chicago School's approach to antitrust, this emphasis on consumer welfare. And what he said is we needed firm ground to stand on. So jurisprudence at the time was fairly arbitrary in antitrust cases. There was a perception that there was no way to anticipate the outcome. And Breyer felt that acutely, and what appealed to him about the Chicago standard was that it provided certainty. He didn't endorse it on the grounds that it was, the best for the public or that it got the thing right. The baseline benefit was that it allowed consistency, which has its own virtues. But I think it's absolutely part of the appeal.
I think we're coming out here very pro-economist. I'm loving this. More questions,
So
please.
incorrect consistency is better than correct inconsistency?
I mean, there are probably some arguments for it, right? Like if businesses can anticipate that you'll be wrong in a consistent way, they may be able to, plan for that. I mean,
Clearly, I should have been an economist instead of a math major. There was another question over there.
Yeah, so this question is kind of related to what you guys were talking about. I noticed during your discussion, this back and forth kept coming up about an economist kind of on the mount preaching, and an economist, who's like a heretic economist getting in good with a politician and getting his policy passed. I think it reminded me of a lot of discussions I have, especially about like Laffer, is he an accepted economist or not? And I was wondering, a question to both of you, is good economic policy work about coming to a better consensus and kind of coming up with better ideas, or is it about convincing politicians or decision makers to listen to the current good consensus? Do you think the current ideas are sufficient and we need to get them into policy, or do you think that we need better ideas before we should implement any policy, before economists should kind of have their hour?
It's a fantastic question. We'll let you go first.
I mean, I think the answer depends on the space. I mean, there are areas in which I think economists have arrived at a consensus that makes sense, at least to me, and that the primary task is, for example, convincing policymakers to embrace some form of carbon taxation, which clearly has merit as a policy solution, is an area in which economists are in broad agreement and have not gained much traction in the policy space. And then there are areas in which I think economists seem unable to agree among themselves, and when you go to policymakers and there's 5 guys on this side and 5 guys on that side, I'm not sure that there's a lot of noise and not a lot of signal. So I think it really depends on the area.
The more consensus, the more loud the voice should be.
I think that, you don't want to confuse consensus always with being right, but I think that it is the case that one issue with economics that I really struggle with is the question of why economists are able to sustain debates that seem like they ought to be able to be resolved. it should be the case that economics can arrive at a clean answer on this, and yet you've got PhD economists yelling at each other and telling each other that they're wrong. Wealth taxation is a really good current example of this. I mean, there are normative questions around wealth taxation, but what we also have is some very prominent economists yelling at each other and insisting that they're doing the economics wrong.
Well, I think they're doing the measurement. They're doing the measurement different. But I think some of it is life doesn't, unlike other sciences, doesn't give us clean experiments. There are times, you think, I would like to take state A and throw them into a deep recession and do the same for state B and then do different policies on them and see which one works better. And that's the way, if I was a physicist or a chemist, that's the way I would work. The problem is economics, for particularly the big questions, the ones that we're talking about, things like growth and inequality and such, those are hard to run policies on in a complex environment to figure out how we're going to respond. And so because we have this difficulty of actually the world we're trying to measure is difficult, and we don't have those clean experiments, ambiguity persists for longer than it does in other dimensions.
One thing I'd say, just so you can add one thing, is I think that there is room for a more creative approach in some areas. You can imagine, for example...
Can I throw Texas into a recession?
You could imagine, I'm not going to endorse that.
Okay.
You can imagine, for example, that the federal government could become fairly systematic about using pilot programs to experiment with economic policies.
Yes.
So, if you want to know about the effects of minimum wages or about some redesign of tax policy or about some benefit program, they're very reluctant right now to, essentially authorize a program to...
So much time.
Yes, exactly.
Pretty much done.
And see how it works and draw conclusions from that. So you can.
But even that's difficult because a lot of the other interesting stuff is how the things work together. So if you run a little local one, does that scale up? So even there becomes harder. But I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of that.
I was thinking as you were talking, damn that messy thing called humanity that won't conform to economist models. The book is incredibly nuanced. At the end, Binya writes, the market economy remains one of humankind's most awesome inventions, a powerful machine for the creation of wealth. So I wanted to end on a question for you. How much would you rewrite the rules of the market? To what extent would you rewrite it? Is this something that needs tinkering on the edges or a radical rethink?
I think that there are areas in which we are overly reliant on the market, and that there may be better approaches to providing some forms of goods and services. I think there are areas in which we are appropriately reliant on the market, but we need better rules to regulate the marketplace. And I think there are areas in which markets are doing great, and we ought to embrace and applaud. So I don't know exactly how to size the answer. I think our society, my own view is that we have big problems and we need to make big changes in our approach to economic policy. So I guess, but I don't at all think that we ought to be abandoning markets. I think that markets are the best mechanism that we have for dealing with many of our problems. Our challenge is to write better rules for those markets.
Perhaps it's a variation on Winston Churchill's famous quote about democracy, right? The worst possible system with the possible exception of everything else that's ever been proposed. On that note, thank you all very much for coming out. And thank you so much for coming here to Chicago for this debate. And Erik, thank you for your participation.